Maplewood was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else. Nestled deep within the embrace of a vast forest, it was a place that had remained untouched by time, where the biggest concerns were the annual harvest festival or the high school football games. But the serenity was shattered one fateful night when the first body was found. It was a quiet, chilly evening in October. The leaves had turned golden, and the air carried a crispness that signaled the onset of winter. The town streets were nearly deserted, with most residents nestled in their homes, safe from the cold. But in one house, there was no warmth. The front door stood slightly ajar, and a chilling breeze blew through the open gap. Inside, the once peaceful home had been transformed into a scene of unimaginable horror. Sheriff Daniels was the first to arrive after a neighbor had reported a strange smell. He wasn't prepared for what he found. The body of Mrs. Carver, a widow in her late 60s, lay sprawled on the living room floor. Her face was twisted in a grotesque expression of terror, her eyes wide open, as if she had seen something that defied understanding. Her throat had been slashed, and the blood that had once pumped through her veins was now dried and dark on the floor beneath her. The room was eerily quiet, the only sound the creaking of the old house as the wind pressed against its walls. But there was something even more disturbing about the scene. Mrs. Carver's body had been meticulously arranged, her arms crossed over her chest, and a single, wilted rose placed in her hands. It was as if the killer had taken his time, as if this was a ritual he had performed before. The thought sent a shiver down the sheriff's spine. The autopsy revealed no clues, no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing to identify the killer. The town was gripped with fear, but as days turned into weeks, the initial shock began to fade. Life returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the shadow of death still loomed large over Maplewood. Emily Thompson had lived in Maplewood all her life. She was in her mid-20s, worked as a librarian at the local library, and lived alone in a small cottage on the outskirts of town. She loved the peace and quiet of her home, surrounded by towering trees and the sound of birdsong in the mornings. But ever since Mrs. Carver's death, a sense of unease had settled over her. It started with small things. A misplaced book here, a drawer left open there. At first, Emily chalked it up to her own forgetfulness. She had always been a bit absent-minded, prone to losing track of things. But as the days went by, the incidents became harder to ignore. One evening, Emily returned home from work to find her front door unlocked. She was certain she had locked it that morning. Her heart raced as she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside that cast long, eerie shadows on the walls. She fumbled for the light switch and flicked it on. Everything seemed normal at first glance. But as Emily walked through her home, she noticed that something was off. In the kitchen, a chair had been pulled out from the table, as if someone had been sitting there. In the living room, a throw pillow was on the floor, though she was sure she had left it on the couch. But it was in her bedroom that she found the most disturbing sign. Her bed, which she always made neatly in the morning, was a mess. The covers were thrown back, and the sheets were rumpled as if someone had been lying in it. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead as she backed out of the room, her mind racing. Had someone been in her house? Was someone still there? She grabbed the phone and called Sheriff Daniels. He arrived within minutes, his face grim as he listened to Emily's story. He searched the house thoroughly but found no signs of forced entry, no indication that anyone other than Emily had been there. "Could you have left the door unlocked by mistake?" he asked gently, not wanting to alarm her further. Emily shook her head. "No, I'm sure I locked it. And the bed. I haven't touched it since this morning." The sheriff frowned, but there was little he could do. Without any evidence of a break-in, it was hard to justify further action. He promised to keep an eye on things and advised Emily to be extra cautious. That night, Emily barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside made her jump. She kept the lights on and clutched her phone in her hand, ready to call for help at the slightest noise. But the night passed uneventfully, and by morning, she began to wonder if she had imagined the whole thing. But deep down, Emily knew something was wrong. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a gnawing sense of dread that wouldn't go away. The days that followed were tense. Emily became hyper-aware of everything around her. She double-checked her locks, installed new ones, and even got a security system installed. But the feeling of being watched persisted. She began to notice a figure in the distance, just at the edge of her vision, but whenever she turned to look, it was gone. At work, she couldn't concentrate. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the strange occurrences at home. She confided in her best friend Sarah, who tried to reassure her that it was probably just stress. "You've been through a lot lately," Sarah said one afternoon as they sat in the library's break room. "With everything that's happened in town, it's no wonder you're feeling on edge, but you can't let it get to you. It's just your mind playing tricks." Emily nodded, but Sarah's words did little to calm her nerves. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching her, waiting. Then, one evening, as she was getting ready for bed, she heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from the attic. It was a soft thud, followed by a scraping noise like something being dragged across the floor. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She had always hated the attic, with its dark corners and creaky floorboards. She rarely went up there, and now the thought of someone hiding in that dusty, forgotten space filled her with terror. She forced herself to move, to grab the flashlight from her nightstand, and slowly made her way to the attic door. The sound stopped as she approached, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. With trembling hands, she reached for the doorknob and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a set of narrow stairs leading up into darkness. Emily hesitated, every instinct telling her to turn back, to run. But she had to know. She couldn't live in fear any longer. Taking a deep breath, she ascended the stairs, the flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The attic was just as she remembered it, cluttered with old furniture, boxes of forgotten memories, and a thick layer of dust covering everything. She swept the light around the room, searching for any sign of an intruder, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The noise had stopped, and the only sound was the pounding of her own heart. She was about to turn and go back downstairs when something caught her eye. A small, rectangular object on the floor, partially hidden under a dusty blanket. Emily knelt down and carefully pulled the blanket aside. It was an old wooden box, its surface scratched and worn with age. She didn't recognize it and couldn't remember ever seeing it before. Curiosity piqued, she opened the box. Inside, she found a collection of old photographs, yellowed with age. They were pictures of her house, taken from various angles, but what sent a chill down her spine was that they were recent. The trees, the car, and the flowers in the garden were all exactly as they were now. The final photograph made her gasp. It was a picture of her, sitting in her living room completely unaware that she was being watched. The angle of the shot suggested it had been taken from just outside the window. Emily dropped the box and backed away, her mind racing. Someone had been in her house. Someone had been watching her, photographing her. She stumbled back down the stairs, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She grabbed her phone and called the sheriff, barely able to speak as she explained what she had found. Sheriff Daniels arrived quickly, his face set in a grim line as he listened to Emily's story. He examined the box of photographs in the attic, but again, there were no signs of forced entry, no clues left behind by the intruder. "Emily, I believe you," he said, his voice low and serious. "But whoever this is, they're good. They know how to cover their tracks. I'll do everything I can to catch them, but I need you to be careful. Don't stay here alone if you can help it." Emily nodded, but the fear had already taken root deep within her. She knew she couldn't go on living like this, constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for the next move. The following days were a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. Emily tried to keep herself busy, to distract her mind from the terror that had taken hold of her, but it was no use. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the photographs, felt the eyes on her, and heard the creaking of the attic. Then, one night, it happened. Emily was jolted awake by a loud crash from downstairs. She sat up in bed, her heart racing, and listened. The house was dark and silent, but she knew she hadn't imagined the noise. It had been real, and it had come from inside her home. She grabbed the flashlight from her nightstand and crept out of bed, her hands shaking as she made her way to the door. She opened it slowly, peering out into the hallway. The house was still and quiet, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. She descended the stairs, each step feeling like an eternity. When she reached the bottom, she saw the source of the noise. A vase had been knocked off the table in the living room, shattered pieces scattered across the floor. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Someone had been in the house, and they were still there. She backed away, her mind racing. She needed to get out, to call for help, but before she could act, a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness. The man was tall, his face obscured by a mask. He moved with a slow, deliberate pace, like a predator closing in on its prey. Emily's blood ran cold as she realized that she was face to face with the Night Stalker. He didn't speak, didn't make a sound as he advanced toward her. Emily backed up until she was against the wall, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The fear that had been building inside her for weeks exploded into full-blown terror. But something inside her snapped. She wasn't going to be a victim. Not like Mrs. Carver. Not like the others. With a surge of adrenaline, Emily grabbed a heavy lamp from a nearby table and swung it at the man with all her strength. The lamp connected with his head, and he staggered back, momentarily stunned. Emily took her chance and ran for the front door, her heart pounding in her chest. She fumbled with the lock, her hands trembling, but finally managed to get it open. She burst out into the cold night air, her breath coming in gasps. She ran to the neighbor's house, banging on the door, screaming for help. By the time Sheriff Daniels arrived, the Night Stalker was gone, but he had left something behind, a message written in blood on the wall of Emily's living room. "I see you." The days that followed were a blur of police investigations, interviews, and a growing sense of dread. The sheriff had placed Emily under protective custody, but she knew it was only a matter of time before the Night Stalker struck again. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The fear had become a part of her, a constant presence that gnawed at her every waking moment. Then, one evening, Sheriff Daniels called with news that both shocked and terrified her. They had identified the Night Stalker. He was a man named Richard Hale, a drifter with a history of violent crimes. He had been living in the woods outside Maplewood, hiding in an old abandoned cabin. The police had found his hideout, along with a collection of macabre trophies from his victims, including the photographs of Emily. But Richard Hale had vanished. The cabin was empty, and there was no sign of where he might have gone. The sheriff warned Emily to be on high alert, as Hale was likely to come after her again. Emily's fear reached a fever pitch. She knew she couldn't live like this, constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for the inevitable. She had to confront the Night Stalker once and for all. She made a plan. It was risky, but she had no other choice. She would lure Hale out of hiding, make him come to her, and end this nightmare once and for all. That night, Emily returned to her house alone, for the first time since the attack. She made sure the front door was unlocked, and then she waited. The house was dark and silent, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. Her heart raced as she sat in the living room, clutching a knife in her hand, every muscle in her body tensed for what was to come. Hours passed and nothing happened. The tension was unbearable, every creak of the house making her jump. But then, just as she was about to give up, she heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from the back of the house. Emily's breath caught in her throat. He was here. She waited, her grip on the knife tightening as the sound grew louder. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving closer and closer. She knew she only had one chance to get this right. The figure appeared in the doorway, tall and menacing, just as he had been that night. But this time, Emily was ready. With a cry, she lunged at him, the knife flashing in the dim light. The blade struck true, sinking into his chest. Hale staggered back, a look of shock and pain on his face as he fell to the floor. Emily stood over him, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the adrenaline still pumping through her veins. The nightmare was finally over. But as she looked down at the man who had terrorized her for so long, a cold, empty feeling settled over her. She had won, but at what cost? The fear that had consumed her was gone, but in its place was something darker, something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. The news of Richard Hale's death spread quickly through Maplewood. The town breathed a collective sigh of relief, grateful that the nightmare was finally over. But for Emily, the end of the Night Stalker was just the beginning of a new chapter in her life. She knew she could never return to the life she had before. The fear, the paranoia, the sense of being hunted, those feelings would never fully go away. She had survived, but she was no longer the same person she had been. As she stood at the edge of the forest looking out at the trees that had once provided her with comfort and solitude, she realized that she could never go back to the way things were. The world was a darker, more dangerous place than she had ever imagined, and she would have to live with that knowledge for the rest of her life. But she was a survivor. She had faced her worst fears and come out on the other side. And no matter what the future held, she knew she would never let fear control her again.